Starting this month, we'll keep our finances separate, the husband announced. All right, the wife replied calmly. She had anticipated this shift for quite some time. But had he? The kitchen was alive with the rich, savory scent of roasted chicken, mingling with the earthy notes of rosemary and thyme that wafted through the air. The golden glow of the oven light cast a cozy warmth across the room, bouncing off the worn wooden cabinets Charlotte had been meaning to repaint for years. She slid on a pair of faded blue oven mitts, ones Donald had bought her ages ago at a flea market, and carefully pulled the heavy roasting pan from the oven. The chicken, crispy-skinned and glistening with herb-flecked juices, was perfection. It was Donald's favourite, a tradition she'd started on a whim early in their marriage, back when they were still figuring each other out. Every Friday for 18 years she'd made it, tweaking the recipe over time until it was just right. A quiet ritual that anchored their weeks. In the background, the soft, rhythmic clinking of porcelain and silverware filled the space as Jessie moved around the table with the ease of habit. At 17, she'd long since mastered the art of setting the table, her slender fingers arranging forks and knives with a practiced grace. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, swaying slightly as she leaned over to adjust a napkin. "Mom, you outdid yourself again," she called over her shoulder, her tone light but genuine. She peeked at the chicken, her stomach growling audibly, and flashed a quick grin. "Can we eat soon? I'm starving." "Dinner's ready," Charlotte replied, her voice carrying that familiar mix of warmth and authority as she began slicing into the bird. The knife glided through the tender meat, steam rising as she portioned out generous pieces onto 3 plates. She glanced up at the clock, 6:47 p.m., and noted Donald wasn't at the table yet, which was unusual. Friday dinners were sacred, and he was almost always the first one seated, newspaper in hand, ready to unwind from the week. Just then, Donald appeared in the doorway, his broad frame filling the space. His greying hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd run his hands through it one too many times, and his button-down shirt was wrinkled at the sleeves. Charlotte's eyes flicked to his face, catching the strange, tight smile that tugged at his lips. A smile she knew too well. It wasn't the easy, contented one he wore when he was relaxed. No, this was the smile he'd had when he told her about the promotion that meant longer hours, or the time he'd dented her car backing out of the garage and wasn't sure how she'd take it. After 18 years, she could read him like an open book, and that look meant something was brewing, something big, something he wasn't sure how to drop on them. "It smells delicious," Donald said as he stepped into the room, his voice steady but carrying a faint edge. He pulled out his chair at the head of the table and sat down, folding his hands in front of him. His eyes darted briefly to Charlotte, then to Jessie, who was sliding into her seat across from him, oblivious to the undercurrent in the air. "Thanks, hon," Charlotte said, setting a plate in front of him. She kept her tone casual, but her mind was already turning, sifting through possibilities. She placed Jessie's plate next, then her own, and settled into her chair, smoothing her apron over her lap. "Rough day at the office?" she asked, tilting her head slightly as she studied him. It was a gentle opener, an invitation to spill whatever was behind that smile. Donald picked up his fork, poking at a piece of chicken before looking up at her. "Not exactly," he said, his smile tightening just a fraction. He cleared his throat, glancing at Jessie, who was already digging into her food, oblivious to the shift in his demeanour. "Actually, there's something I need to talk to you both about." Jessie paused mid-bite, a drumstick halfway to her mouth, and raised an eyebrow. "Uh-oh," she said, her voice teasing but curious. "What did you do, Dad? Forget to pay the electric bill again?" Donald let out a small, nervous chuckle, shaking his head. "No, nothing like that." He set his fork down and leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the edge of the table. The kitchen, moments ago a haven of warmth and routine, seemed to shrink as the weight of Donald's words settled over the table. Jessie slouched in her chair, her phone still glowing in her hand, but her thumb had stopped scrolling. She tilted her head just enough to peek over the screen, her sharp green eyes flicking between her parents. She wasn't fooling anyone. least of all Charlotte, who knew her daughter's tricks too well. But Jessie kept up the charade, pretending to be engrossed in whatever TikTok or text thread she'd pulled up. Her lips twitched slightly, like she was biting back a comment, waiting to see how this played out. Donald, oblivious to the shift in the air, speared a juicy chunk of chicken with his fork, cutting into it with deliberate care. "Listen, dear," he said, his tone measured, almost rehearsed. He popped the bite into his mouth, chewing slowly as if savouring it gave him time to gather his thoughts. After swallowing, he dabbed at his mouth with a napkin and looked at Charlotte with that same tense smile. "I've been thinking. We need to reconsider our family budget a bit." Charlotte eased into her seat across from him, her hands resting lightly on the table. A faint pang of anxiety tightened her chest, but she kept her face smooth, her voice even. "Oh, really?" she said, tilting her head slightly as she picked up her own fork. She wasn't about to let him see her rattled. Not yet. "Yes," Donald went on, wiping his lips again, clearly enjoying the moment more than the chicken. He straightened in his chair, his tone taking on a hint of pride, like he was unveiling some brilliant plan. "Starting this month, we'll manage separate finances. I've calculated everything thoroughly, worked it all out in my head, and I think this is fair. Each of us will spend only what we earn." He leaned back, folding his hands over his stomach, looking at her expectantly as if she might applaud his ingenuity. Jessie's head snapped up from her phone, her pretense of disinterest crumbling. She stared at her father, one eyebrow arched high, her fork dangling forgotten in her hand. "So it would be reasonable," he continued, his eyes still on Charlotte, "if I just allocate you a fixed amount for household expenses, groceries, utilities, that sort of thing, and I'll manage my own funds." He nodded to himself, satisfied, like he'd just solved a puzzle no one else could crack. Charlotte's fork paused mid-air, a small piece of chicken speared on the tines. She brought it to her mouth and chewed slowly, her jaw working as her mind raced. 18 years of pooling every paycheck, every bonus, every tax refund. Gone. Just like that. She swallowed, the familiar taste of her own cooking suddenly bland against the bitterness creeping up her throat. Her eyes locked on Donald's, searching his face for a crack in his confidence, some sign this was a joke, or at least negotiable. But he just sat there, waiting for her to agree, like he'd handed her a gift. The silence stretched tight, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Jessie shifted in her seat, her phone now face down on the table, her full attention on the standoff. "Wait, hold up," she said, leaning forward, her voice sharper now. "Mom's the one who pays for everything. How's this fair if she's still covering for everything and you're just, what, keeping your pension or whatever?" Donald's smile faltered for the first time, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Jessie, this isn't about that," he said, his tone clipped. "It's about independence, responsibility. Your mother and I have always worked as a team, but I think it's time we each take charge of our own contributions." "Contributions," Jessie snorted, crossing her arms. "Mom's the only one contributing. You've been consulting from the couch for 3 years. "Jessie," Charlotte said quietly, her voice calm but firm, a warning to dial it back. She set her fork down and folded her hands in her lap, turning her gaze back to Donald. "So let me get this straight," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "You want me to keep paying the bills, keep the house running, and you'll, what, take your retirement money and do your own thing? Is that the plan?" Donald shifted in his chair, his confidence starting to crack under her steady stare. "It's not like that, Charlotte," he said, softer now, backpedaling just a touch. "I just thought, after all these years, we could try something new. I'd still help out. I'm not abandoning you." The tension in the kitchen lingered like a stubborn fog, but Charlotte cut through it with the precision of a seasoned chef. "All right," she said, her voice steady as she speared another piece of chicken and brought it to her plate. She didn't raise her eyes from her task, her movements calm and deliberate, as if Donald had just suggested switching brands of dish soap instead of upending their entire financial life. Donald nearly choked on his next bite, the fork halfway to his mouth. He coughed, setting it down with a clatter, his eyes widening as he stared at her. He'd braced himself for a storm, tears streaming down her face, sharp words flying across the table, maybe even a plate slammed down in frustration. He'd seen her fire up before, like the time he'd forgotten to tell her about the fishing trip that drained their savings account. But this quiet acceptance, it threw him off balance. "Just all right?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion, almost pleading for her to give him something more to work with. Charlotte finally looked up, her hazel eyes meeting his with a cool, unreadable gaze. "What do you want to hear?" she said, tilting her head slightly. "Haven't you already decided everything?" Her tone was even, almost conversational, but there was a subtle edge beneath it, a hint of something he couldn't quite pin down. Across the table, Jessie let out a sudden snort of laughter, quickly masking it with a fake cough into her napkin. Her shoulders shook as she tried to play it off, but her eyes sparkled with amusement. She darted a glance at her mom, then back at her dad, clearly enjoying the unexpected twist in the script. "Well, yes," Donald mumbled, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his napkin, folding and unfolding it as a strange unease crept up his spine. He'd had this whole speech planned, charts in his head, justifications ready to roll off his tongue, but Charlotte's calm was like a wall he couldn't climb. "I just thought you'd have more to say." "Then we've decided everything," Charlotte said simply, giving him a small, tight nod. She picked up her knife and sliced into her chicken again, the blade gliding through with a soft scrape. "Of course," she added, almost as an afterthought before turning to Jessie. "By the way, the chicken turned out especially well today, don't you think?" Jessie, still recovering from her coughing fit, grinned and nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, Mom, it's awesome. Did you do something different with the herbs?" She took another bite, chewing with exaggerated appreciation, clearly eager to steer the conversation anywhere but back to her dad's bombshell. Charlotte smiled, a real one this time, soft and warm, and leaned toward her daughter. "Just a little extra time. I thought it might brighten it up. How's that history project going, by the way? Didn't you say you were presenting next week?" Donald sat there, his fork hovering over his plate, watching the exchange with a growing sense of bewilderment. The room had shifted around him, the spotlight slipping away as Charlotte and Jessie launched into a discussion about school, something about a PowerPoint on the Industrial Revolution and a teacher who couldn't pronounce cotton gin. He opened his mouth to interject, then closed it again, his brow furrowing. Something about Charlotte's reaction gnawed at him, a quiet unease he couldn't name. She wasn't fighting him, wasn't even questioning him, and yet it didn't feel like a win. It felt like he'd missed a step, like the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he'd thought. He took a slow bite of chicken, chewing mechanically as he studied her. The way she laughed at Jessie's impression of her teacher, the way her hands moved smoothly as she refilled her water glass. It was all so normal, so composed. Too composed, maybe. He swallowed, the taste of the meal suddenly less satisfying. "You sure you're okay with this?" he ventured, his voice quieter now, testing the waters. Charlotte paused, her glass halfway to her lips, and glanced at him. "Oh, I'm fine, Donald," she said, her smile faint but steady. "We'll figure it out. We always do." She took a sip, then turned back to Jessie. "So, did you get that extra credit sorted out, or are you still negotiating with Mr. Hargrove?" Donald leaned back in his chair, his appetite fading. The chicken sat heavy on his plate, and the kitchen, once a comforting cocoon, felt oddly foreign. Charlotte's smile lingered as she nodded along to Jessie's animated recounting of her chemistry class. Something about a lab gone wrong, a beaker fizzing over, and Mr. Hargrove's mustache twitching in panic. "He looked like he was going to combust himself," Jessie said, giggling as she mimicked his flustered flapping. Charlotte laughed softly, but a faint crease deepened on her forehead, the only sign of the storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. She twirled her fork absently, her mind already drifting. Well, she thought, if he wants separate finances, he'll get them. Let's see how that plays out. Monday morning dawned crisp and quiet, the usual rhythm of the house subtly off-key. Donald shuffled into the kitchen in his plaid slippers, his hair still tousled from sleep, expecting the familiar comfort of routine to greet him. The sun streamed through the window, glinting off the countertops, and the faint scent of last night's chicken lingered in the air. He yawned, stretching as he opened the cupboard above the sink, reaching for his prized Italian coffee, the dark, velvety blend with just a whisper of bitterness that he'd sworn by for years. His fingers groped the shelf, brushing past an old box of tea bags and a half-empty jar of instant decaf. But the sleek silver bag he loved was nowhere to be found. "Charlotte," he called, his voice gruff with early morning grogginess as he leaned out of the kitchen and peered down the hall toward the bedroom. "Where's my coffee?" "Oh, right," came her reply, drifting back to him with an unruffled calm that made his stomach twist. Charlotte stepped into view, already dressed in her Pilates gear, black leggings and a loose grey tank top, tugging her hair into a neat ponytail. "I didn't buy it," she said, glancing at him as she adjusted an elastic around her wrist. "I've got my own separate budget now, remember? And that coffee's too expensive for me to keep picking up." Her tone was light, matter of fact, like she was reciting the weather forecast. No bite, no venom, just a quiet, unshakable indifference that hit him harder than any argument could have. Donald froze, his hand still hovering in the cupboard, the empty space where his coffee belonged staring back at him. A cold, unpleasant sensation crept up his chest, prickling at the back of his neck. He blinked, waiting for the punchline, but Charlotte just turned back to her gym bag, humming a faint tune, something upbeat, maybe an old pop song she liked. The sound floated through the house as she zipped up the bag and slung it over her shoulder, her movements smooth and unhurried. "All right," he muttered under his breath, shutting the cupboard with a little more force than necessary. "I'll buy it on the way." His voice was clipped, but he kept it low, unsure whether he was annoyed at her or at the sudden shift in his morning. He grabbed his keys from the counter and shuffled toward the garage, the absence of that rich coffee aroma already souring his mood. Fine, he thought. I'll handle it myself. But deep down, a nagging feeling told him this was just the opening move in a game he hadn't realized he'd started. As he backed the car out of the driveway, he caught a glimpse of Charlotte through the living room window, stretching into a warm-up pose before heading to her class. She looked content. Too content, maybe. He shook his head, turning up the radio to drown out the unease gnawing at him. The grocery store was only a 10-minute drive. He'd grab the coffee, maybe a bagel, and get his day back on track. But as he pulled into the parking lot, a realization hit him. His wallet was still sitting on the dresser, and the only cash he had was a crumpled $5 bill in the glove box. The Italian roast was $12 a bag. He sat there, engine idling, staring at the store entrance and muttered a curse under his breath. This was just the beginning, and somehow he suspected Charlotte knew it. That evening, the kitchen felt like a battlefield Donald hadn't realized he'd wandered into. He stood in front of the open fridge, the cool air brushing against his face as he stared at the sparse contents. A bag of wilted spinach, a half-empty carton of milk, and a couple of Tupperware containers with Jessie scrawled across the lids in black marker stared back at him. No leftovers from Monday's roast, no cold cuts for a quick sandwich, nothing he could cobble together into a meal. "Where?" he started, his voice trailing off as he turned toward Charlotte, who sat at the table with her nose buried in a paperback, a steaming mug of tea at her elbow. "Your half of the fridge is empty," she said without looking up, her tone as flat as if she were reading the grocery list aloud. She turned a page, her finger tracing the edge of the paper. "Jessie and I bought groceries for our side." Donald blinked, the words sinking in slowly. He shut the fridge door with a soft thud and leaned against it, crossing his arms. "Your side?" he echoed, but Charlotte didn't respond, just sipped her tea and kept reading. He stood there for a moment, the hum of the fridge filling the silence, before trudging off to rummage through the pantry instead. A can of tuna and some stale crackers would have to do. The next day, the cracks in his routine widened. He reached for his shampoo in the shower, only to find the bottle bone dry. Later, as he scraped a razor across his jaw, the last smear of shaving gel ran out mid-stroke, leaving him with a patchy stubble and a growing irritation. By Thursday, the car's gas gauge hovered just above empty. He'd been meaning to fill it, but the week had slipped away from him. And a utility bill arrived in the mail, addressed solely to Donald R. Harper. He stared at the envelope, the bold print of his name mocking him, and felt the weight of it all piling up. By Friday morning, he'd had enough. Charlotte was slipping on her sneakers by the front door, ready to head out. Pilates again. Or maybe that book club she'd mentioned picking back up. "Listen," he said, his voice tight as he stepped into her path, blocking the doorway. "Is this some kind of demonstration?" He gestured vaguely around them, at the house that suddenly felt like it was conspiring against him. Charlotte paused, one hand adjusting a new scarf, a soft, emerald green thing that caught the light just right. Donald's eyes lingered on it for a second, a fleeting thought cutting through his frustration. She'd been looking different lately, hadn't she? Sharper somehow, more put together. She tilted her head, meeting his gaze with genuine surprise. "Demonstration?" she repeated, her brows lifting slightly. "No, why would I? I'm just following our new financial principles. Everyone spends only what they earn." Her voice was kind, almost gentle, as she added, "I don't work like you, remember? I only have the amount you allocated for household needs." Donald opened his mouth, then faltered, the words tangling up in his throat. "But you always—" He stopped, the realization hitting him like a slow-motion punch. How many things had he taken for granted? The coffee on the shelf, the fridge stocked with his favorites, the gas tank magically full week after week. All of it. Her quiet labor holding their life together while he coasted along. "Always what?" Charlotte prompted, her head tilting slightly, a faint smile playing on her lips. She stepped closer, her eyes steady on his. "Always bought groceries, paid bills, filled up your car?" "Yes, dear," he managed, his voice quieter now, caught off guard by how easily she'd finished his sentence. "But that was when we had a joint budget." "Exactly," she said simply, her smile softening into something almost sympathetic. She reached past him to grab her keys from the hook by the door, the scarf brushing against her shoulder as she moved. "Things are different now, aren't they? You wanted separate, so here we are." Jessie bounced into the hallway, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the hardwood floor. She was decked out in her usual Friday gear, ripped jeans, a faded band tee, and a lightweight jacket tied around her waist, ready for whatever after-school plans she'd cooked up. "Mum, you haven't forgotten, have you?" she called, her voice dripping with playful innocence as she adjusted her ponytail. She shot a quick sidelong glance at Donald, barely acknowledging him, before focusing on Charlotte. "We're going to the cafe after school, right?" Charlotte turned from the door, her gym bag still dangling from her shoulder, and gave Jessie a warm pat on the arm. "Of course, sweetheart," she said, her tone light and conspiratorial. "I set aside money for our little treats." She flashed a smile, a real one, bright and easy, that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. The two of them shared a quick, knowing look, like partners in crime, before heading out together. The door swung shut behind them, leaving Donald standing in the quiet, the echo of their laughter fading into the walls. He shuffled back to the kitchen, the silence pressing in around him, thick and unfamiliar. His eyes caught on something new, a small, neatly written note taped to the fridge door. He stepped closer, squinting at the familiar curve of Charlotte's handwriting. Left side, Mum and Jessie. Right side, Dad. The words stared back at him, simple and stark, dividing the space he'd always thought of as theirs into territories he hadn't agreed to. He reached out, brushing his fingers over the paper, and felt a strange pang twist in his chest. Something like sadness, maybe, or the discomfort of being left behind. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel like home. It felt like a place where he was just visiting. His phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him out of his thoughts. Maybe Charlotte's changed her mind, he thought for a fleeting second, a flicker of hope sparking. He fished it out, but the screen lit up with a cold, impersonal message. Dear client, we remind you of the need to pay the utility bill. Please settle your balance by... The bank. Of course. Donald's grip tightened around the phone, his knuckles whitening as he took a deep, shaky breath. Something in his plan, his brilliant, fair, logical plan, had veered wildly off course, and he was starting to feel the weight of it. He sighed, a heavy, defeated sound, and yanked open the fridge again. The right side, his side, gaped back at him, barren except for a lonely ketchup bottle and a questionable stick of butter. The left side, though, was stocked. A carton of orange juice, a pack of yogurt, a neatly wrapped sandwich with Jessie's name on it. He shut the door harder than he meant to, the rattle echoing in the empty kitchen. Fine, he muttered to himself, grabbing his keys from the counter. I'll stop by the store, get the gas, the coffee, the shampoo. His mental shopping list stretched longer with every step toward the garage. Groceries, toiletries, maybe some razor blades too. It was nothing, he told himself as he climbed into the car. She was just testing him, pushing back in her quiet, stubborn way. Soon enough, everything would snap back to normal. The day hit Donald like a freight train with no brakes. It started with morning traffic, a snarl of honking cars and exhaust fumes that trapped him on the freeway for 40 minutes, turning his commute into a slow-motion nightmare. By the time he got to the office, his tie was crooked and his mood was already sour. Then came the gut punch. An important deal he'd been banking on fell apart over a single misinterpreted email, leaving him staring at his desk phone in disbelief. And just when he thought he could salvage the day, a key client called to cancel their end-of-week meeting. No explanation, just a curt, "We'll reschedule." His head throbbed, a dull buzz building behind his eyes, and his stomach growled loud enough to earn a glance from the intern in the next cubicle. Lunch had been a rushed affair, a dry turkey sandwich from the cafe across the street, wolfed down between phone calls. It barely counted as food. Driving home, he slouched in the driver's seat, the weight of the day pressing down on him. I'll order something tasty, he decided, his voice rough as he pulled out of the parking lot. Pizza or sushi? Something good. He fumbled with his phone at a red light, opening the delivery app with one hand while steering with the other. The screen loaded, and he tapped to check his card balance, then froze. The numbers stared back at him, mockingly low. Yesterday, he'd filled the gas tank to the brim, wincing as the pump ticked past $60. Groceries earlier in the week had gouged him too. When did a loaf of bread and some eggs start costing that much? And the utility bill, the car insurance, the random odds and ends he'd picked up, shampoo, coffee, a razor. It all added up, chipping away at the chunk of money he'd planned to keep for himself. Barely a third of it was left. Oh well, he muttered, swiping to check his second card, the one tied to his savings. I've got backup. Except he didn't. Not really. Last month he'd splurged on that new phone with the fancy camera he barely used, then dropped a couple $100 on a sleek watch he'd worn twice. And those nights at the bar with the guys, beers, wings, a round of shots he'd insisted on covering, had drained what was left. The balance on the screen was a pitiful shadow of what he'd expected. He let out a long, ragged breath, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat. Well, I'll have to go home, he grumbled. There's got to be something edible there. The house was dark when he pulled into the driveway, the windows unlit except for a faint glow from Jessie's room upstairs. He trudged inside, dropping his keys on the counter with a clatter, and yanked open the fridge. His side, Dad's side, greeted him with the same bleak emptiness. The ketchup bottle, the questionable butter, and a single can of soda he'd forgotten about. The left side, though, was a different story. A glimpse of Jessie's labelled containers, mac and cheese, a slice of pie, taunted him, but he wasn't about to cross that line. Not yet. He shut the door and turned to the pantry, rifling through it with dwindling hope. The can of tuna was still there, alongside a bag of rice he'd have to cook from scratch and a jar of pickles he didn't even like. He sank into a chair at the kitchen table, the silence of the house pressing in around him. His stomach growled again, louder this time, and he rubbed a hand over his face. The day had beaten him down, and now even the promise of a decent meal had slipped through his fingers. She's just testing me, he told himself, clinging to the thought like a lifeline. This'll blow over. She'll get tired of it, and things will go back to how they were. But as he stared at the note on the fridge, the tidy handwriting dividing his world in two, that vague unease from earlier crept back in, sharper now. Would it really? The silence of the house greeted Donald like an old friend who'd turned cold, but it was the smell that hit him first, a warm, buttery waft of baking that curled through the air, tugging at his senses. He sniffed, his mouth watering despite the day's exhaustion. Cabbage pies, he thought, his stomach clenching with a hunger that felt primal. They were his favourite, a recipe Charlotte had perfected over the years, the kind of comfort food that took him straight back to simpler times. Weekends at his parents' house, the chaos of kids running around, the promise of something good on the table. He shuffled toward the kitchen, drawn by the scent like a moth to a flame. "Charlotte," he called, his voice rough but hopeful as he poked his head through the doorway. There they were, sitting on the table like a cruel mirage. A platter of golden brown pies, their edges crimped just so, steam still rising from the tops. But before he could step closer, his eyes snagged on the note perched atop the dish, written in Charlotte's precise hand. "This is for us with Jessie. Your half of the fridge is on the right." The words landed like a slap, and he stared at them for a beat before wrenching open the fridge door. His side, Dad's side, mocked him with its barrenness. A half-eaten sandwich, the bread crust curling at the edges from yesterday's pitiful lunch, and that same bottle of ketchup, its label peeling at the corner. The left side, though, brimmed with life, containers neatly stacked, a jug of iced tea, a wedge of cheese he hadn't even known they had. The floor creaked behind him, and Jessie strolled in, a mug of tea cradled in her hands, the steam curling up around her face. She barely glanced at him, her attention on the pie she was clearly about to claim. "Dad, you should be quieter with the door," she said, her tone casual but pointed as she set her mug on the counter. "Mom's lying down after her workout. She's wiped." Donald's gaze drifted back to the platter, the aroma tugging at him like a memory he couldn't quite grasp. "Are those Mum's pies?" he asked, nodding toward them, a flicker of hope in his voice. Jessie shrugged, reaching for one with a nonchalance that stung. "Sorry, but that's our food," she said, her voice steady, almost rehearsed. "You wanted separate finances, remember?" She plucked a pie from the dish, the flaky crust crumbling slightly in her fingers, and gave him a quick, unapologetic glance before heading toward her room, tea in one hand, prize in the other. The sound of her footsteps faded down the hall, leaving Donald alone with the scent of his childhood swirling around him, just out of reach. He stood there, rooted to the spot, the emptiness of the house pressing in tighter. "Maybe we can have dinner together," he called out, his voice softer now, less sure, as he turned toward the bedroom where Charlotte's shadow lingered. "Sorry, dear," came her reply, calm and distant, floating through the half-open door. "Jessie and I already ate. I'm so tired after fitness. Just need to rest." There was no edge to her words, no hint of triumph, just that same quiet indifference that had been unraveling him all week. Donald sank into a chair at the table, the creak of the wood loud in the stillness. His stomach growled again, a hollow ache that matched the one settling into his chest. There was nothing to eat at home, not for him anyway. Ordering takeout was a pipe dream with his card balances what they were, and the thought of dragging himself back to the store felt like climbing a mountain with no peak in sight. He pulled out his phone, figuring he could at least scroll the news, distract himself from the gnawing hunger. But as the screen flickered to life, a message popped up in bold red letters. "Internet service payment required. Please update your billing information." Donald's voice cracked through the quiet house, edged with frustration. "Charlotte, they're disconnecting our internet," he shouted, leaning back in the kitchen chair, the phone still glowing with its accusatory message. "Oh, right," came her reply, drifting in from the bedroom with that same maddening calm. "I only pay for mobile now. The home internet was in your name, remember?" Her words hung in the air, simple and unyielding, like a door gently but firmly shut in his face. He sat there in the dim kitchen, the single overhead light casting long shadows across the table. From down the hall, Jessie's laughter bubbled out of her room, bright and carefree, mingling with the muffled sound of her voice as she chatted with a friend, probably on her phone, using the data plan Charlotte had covered. In the bedroom, a soft melody played, some acoustic playlist Charlotte liked for her evening wind down. She was probably doing her yoga now, stretching out the day's tension while he sat here stewing in his own. The contrast gnawed at him, his world shrinking while theirs carried on, untouched. After another half hour of staring at the empty fridge, then the note, then the dark screen of his phone, Donald gave up. His stomach growled, but his energy was gone, sapped by the day and the slow unraveling of everything he'd assumed was solid. He pushed himself up, the chair scraping against the floor, and trudged toward the bedroom, his slippers shuffling with a defeated rhythm. The door was ajar, and he peeked in to see Charlotte propped up against the headboard, her tablet balanced on her lap, a pair of reading glasses perched on her nose. The soft glow of the screen lit her face, and she looked serene. Too serene. "Charlotte," he started, his voice cautious, testing the waters as he lingered in the doorway. "Can we discuss our finances?" "Of course, dear," she said, not even glancing up from whatever she was reading. Her fingers swiped across the tablet, calm and deliberate. "Tomorrow. I've just made a spending plan for the month. When you start counting everything, a lot becomes clear." There was something in her tone, quiet, steady, with a faint undercurrent of control, that made his throat tighten. He opened his mouth to push back, to say something, but the words didn't come. She'd already turned the page, figuratively and literally, and he was left standing there, adrift. He nodded mutely, more to himself than to her, and shuffled to his side of the bed. The mattress dipped under his weight as he sank down, kicking off his slippers and pulling the blanket up to his chest. He lay there, flat on his back, staring at the ceiling, the same cracked plaster he'd been meaning to fix for years, the same shadows he'd seen 1,000 nights. From the kitchen, the old clock ticked on, its steady rhythm cutting through the silence. He'd always hated that sound, always meant to replace it with something sleeker, quieter, more modern. But now, lying there, a sudden thought struck him like a pinprick. He didn't even know how much a new one cost. Not really. He'd never had to think about it. Charlotte had always handled those details, ticking them off some invisible list while he coasted along. Sunday draped the house in a grey, heavy gloom, the sky outside thick with clouds that seemed to press down on the roof. Donald sat hunched at the kitchen table, his fingers wrapped around a mug of that expensive Italian coffee he'd finally bought, though the victory felt hollow now. He stirred it absently, the spoon clinking against the ceramic, watching the dark liquid swirl. Money was running low. The last week had carved a dent into his finances he couldn't ignore. No more restaurant lunches with clients, just a soggy sandwich from home. His favourite cappuccino from the corner cafe was a memory, replaced by whatever he could brew himself. He'd even called the gym to freeze his membership, another small surrender. But the real sting wasn't the budget cuts. It was the cold distance that had settled into the house, a quiet alienation that hung between him and Charlotte, him and Jessie, like a fog he couldn't wave away. The sound of soft footsteps broke his reverie, and Charlotte breezed into the kitchen, dressed in a new loungewear set, velvety soft, a deep plum colour that hugged her frame just right. Donald's eyes narrowed slightly. Where had she gotten the money for that? She moved to the counter, the faint scent of expensive perfume trailing behind her. Floral with a hint of spice, not the drugstore stuff she used to wear. His stomach twisted, a mix of hunger and something sharper. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm, decisive, as he set the mug down with a thud. Yes, Charlotte replied, turning to face him. She slid into the chair across the table, crossing her arms over her chest, her posture relaxed but unyielding. Go on. This, he said, waving a hand around the kitchen, the empty fridge, the note still taped to its door, the invisible lines drawn through their lives, isn't working. Let's go back to how it was. How it was? Charlotte raised an eyebrow, her lips quirking slightly. You want a joint budget again? Yes, he exhaled, the word heavy with relief and a touch of desperation. I realize I overreacted. This separate thing, it's not what I thought. Funny, she said, standing up and crossing to the window. She leaned against the sill, gazing out at the dreary yard for a moment before turning back to him. There was something new in her eyes, something steady, resolute, like steel beneath silk. I've been thinking that everything is now arranged as it should be. Her voice was calm, but it carried a weight that made the air feel thicker. Donald frowned, leaning forward. What do you mean? Charlotte tilted her head, studying him. Donald, when we got married, I believed a family was a team. Then Jessie came, and I stayed home, happily at first. You started taking everything for granted. Me, the house, the life we had, I always provided for you. Provided? He let out a short, incredulous laugh, the sound grating in the quiet room. What are you talking about? I brought in the money. Did you ever wonder why there was always food in the house? She shot back, her tone still even but piercing. Paid internet, gas in the car, your shirts ironed and ready every morning? She paused, letting the questions hang there, watching his face as the silence stretched. You know what Aunt Naomi told me 10 years ago? Never be without your own money. Never. I took it to heart. She crossed to a drawer near the sink, pulling it open with a soft scrape, and retrieved a thick envelope. She walked back to the table and set it down in front of him, her movements deliberate. I started saving, she said. First from the money you gave me, pinching pennies you never noticed. Then I took up handicrafts, selling embroidery online. After that, I learned manicure, did nails for neighbours, friends, anyone who'd pay. And 3 years ago, I opened an online store. Donald blinked, his mouth parting slightly. You have a business? His voice came out hoarse, disbelieving. Yes, dear, she said, sliding a stack of bank statements from the envelope and spreading them across the table. The numbers stared up at him. Deposits, balances, a steady climb that rivaled his own paycheck. I earn almost as much as you, I just didn't flaunt it. The floor creaked, and Jessie appeared in the doorway, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, a hoodie swallowing her frame. She stopped short, her eyes flicking between her parents, sensing the shift in the room. Donald's gaze darted to her. Does Jessie know? He asked, his throat tight. Of course, Jessie said, stepping forward. She moved to Charlotte's side and squeezed her mother's hand, a quiet solidarity in the gesture. Mom taught me everything. I already have a personal account and savings. Been adding to it with my babysitting money and some Etsy stuff I've sold. Donald stared at them, his wife and daughter, standing together, a united front he hadn't seen coming. The kitchen felt smaller, the walls closing in as his world tilted off its axis. He'd thought he was in control, the one steering the ship, but it turned out that control had slipped from his hands years ago, quietly handed over while he wasn't paying attention. The coffee in his mug had gone cold, the steam long gone, and he pushed it away, the bitter taste lingering in his mouth. Charlotte's smile was soft but edged with something unyielding, a quiet strength that seemed to fill the room. You know, Donald, she said, her voice steady, I'm no longer the naive girl I once was. Now I know the value of my life. And you know what I realized? She glanced at Jessie, her eyes warming as they met her daughter's, before turning back to him. You were right. It's important that everyone lives on what they earn. The words landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward, and Donald felt the ground shift beneath him. Everything had changed, yes, but not in his favour. He looked at his wife, really looked at her, and it was as if a veil had lifted. The woman sitting across from him wasn't the Charlotte he'd built in his mind over the years. Quiet, accommodating, content to orbit his decisions. She was someone new, someone he'd somehow missed. But why? His voice came out tense, almost trembling, betraying the storm churning inside him. Why did you stay silent? He leaned forward slightly, searching her face for an answer that might make sense of it all. Charlotte set the bank statements aside with a gentle nudge, folding her hands on the table in front of her. She met his gaze with that same gentle smile, but there was no hesitation in her eyes. Because I didn't want to shatter your illusion of control, she said calmly, each word measured and deliberate. As long as it suited both of us, it worked. I kept things running, you felt in charge, and we went along. But when you decided to separate our finances, she shrugged, a small, effortless gesture, I just showed you what it really looks like. Donald's eyes dropped to the documents scattered across the table, financial accounts, investments, a steady stream of income, all laid out in black and white. Proof of a life she'd built, brick by brick, right under his nose. He'd walked past that drawer 1,000 times, never suspecting it held anything more than old receipts or spare batteries. All these years, she'd been weaving a safety net he didn't even know they needed, while he'd been coasting on assumptions. His fingers brushed the edge of one statement, the paper cool against his skin, and he felt a hollow ache settle in his chest. And what now? He asked finally, his voice quieter, almost lost in the weight of the moment. Charlotte squinted slightly, tilting her head as if gauging how much he could handle. Then she leaned forward, just enough to close the distance between them, her eyes locking onto his, with a clarity that made him feel exposed. Now, she said, her voice firm but not unkind, we renegotiate our terms, but this time, on equal footing. The kitchen seemed to shrink around him, the air thick with the unspoken shift. Jessie stood silently by her mother's side, her hand still resting lightly on Charlotte's arm, a quiet witness to the turning tide. Donald swallowed, his throat dry, and looked between them, his wife, his daughter, both steady in a way he suddenly wasn't. Equal footing. The phrase echoed in his mind, sharp and unfamiliar. He'd spent years thinking he held the reins, steering their family through life. But now he saw the truth. Charlotte had been the one keeping them afloat, and he'd been too blind to notice. He shifted in his chair, the wood creaking under him, and ran a hand over his face. The old clock ticked on, its steady rhythm a quiet taunt that echoed through the kitchen. Donald had always meant to replace it, its chipped paint, its slightly off-kilter pendulum, the way it seemed to drag out every second, but now it hung there like a relic of his old certainties, mocking the idea that he'd ever truly managed this family. 3 weeks had slipped by since that Sunday reckoning, and the house felt different, reshaped by the unspoken agreement that had taken root. The autumn sun slanted through the windows, lazy and golden, casting warm streaks across the table where Donald sat. Next to the old clock, a new one gleamed, a sleek, modern thing with clean lines and a silent sweep. Charlotte had insisted on keeping both, a compromise that felt like a statement, the past and the present, side by side, neither erasing the other. He hunched over a notebook, the family financial plan spread out before him in black ink, 2 columns of numbers, neatly divided, each representing an equal contribution to the budget. His column and Charlotte's, side by side, a ledger of shared responsibility. The figures stared back at him, unfamiliar and uncomfortable in their precision. For years he'd tossed his paycheck into the pot and let Charlotte handle the rest, never questioning the alchemy that turned it into groceries, gas, and pressed shirts. Now every expense was accounted for, every dollar split down the middle. His gym membership was back, but the restaurant lunches stayed gone. Charlotte's online store funded her new loungewear and that pricey perfume, while his salary covered his coffee and the internet he'd scrambled to reconnect. It wasn't the effortless rhythm he'd known. It felt like work, like stepping onto a tightrope he hadn't trained for. But it was fair. He couldn't argue with that. Charlotte breezed into the kitchen, a mug of tea in her hand, her hair swept back in a loose braid. She glanced at the notebook, then at him, her lips curving into a faint, knowing smile. "How's it looking?" she asked, leaning against the counter, her tone casual but curious. Donald rubbed the back of his neck, the pencil tapping lightly against the table. "It's balanced," he said, the word feeling strange on his tongue. "I had to cut back on a few things, those craft beers I liked, the car wash subscription. But it works. We're even." "Good," she said simply, taking a sip of her tea. "Feels different, doesn't it?" "Yeah," he admitted, leaning back in his chair. "Not bad, just new. I'm still getting used to it." He gestured at the columns, a half smile tugging at his lips. "Never thought I'd be the one crunching numbers like this." Charlotte chuckled softly, setting her mug down. "You're doing fine. It's not about perfection. It's about seeing it all clearly." She nodded toward the clocks. "Like those two. They don't have to match to keep time." He followed her gaze, the old clock ticking alongside the new one, and felt a flicker of something. Acceptance, maybe, or the start of it. The apartment hummed around them, quieter than it had been in weeks, but not empty. Jessie was upstairs, probably sketching designs for her next Etsy listing, her laughter no longer a distant sound he couldn't reach. The alienation had faded, replaced by a tentative rhythm they were all learning to navigate. Donald picked up the pencil again, adding a small note to his column, groceries for Friday dinner, and glanced at Charlotte. "You still making those cabbage pies?" he asked, a hint of hope creeping into his voice. She raised an eyebrow, her smile widening. "Maybe. Depends if we're splitting the ingredients or if you're pitching in extra for the nostalgia." He laughed, a low, genuine sound that felt lighter than he expected. "I'll pitch in," he said. "Equal footing, right?" "Dad?" Jessie's voice cut through the quiet, pulling Donald's attention from the financial plan. She leaned against the kitchen doorway, one socked foot crossed over the other, her hoodie sleeves tugged down over her hands. "Have you seen my blue notebook? It's got all my calculations in it." "Check the living room shelf," he replied without missing a beat, his voice carrying the easy rhythm of routine. "By the way, how are your first investments doing?" Her face lit up, eyes sparking with a mix of pride and excitement. "Oh, imagine. Those stocks Mom recommended? They grew by 12%. I've almost saved enough for those summer design courses I told you about." She grinned, bouncing slightly on her toes, then darted off toward the living room, her energy trailing behind her like a comet's tail. Donald watched her go, running a hand over the stubble prickling his jaw. His daughter was telling him about her financial plans, stocks, savings, ambitions, and for the first time, he was really listening. A few months ago, he might have chuckled, patted her on the head, and dismissed it as kid stuff. 17, plotting investments? He'd have thought it cute, not serious. But now, seeing her hustle, hearing the confidence in her voice, he knew better. The women in his family weren't just capable, they were forces, building their own paths while he'd been looking the other way. Charlotte stepped into the kitchen then, arms laden with reusable shopping bags, the faint rustle of paper and plastic breaking his reverie. She set them on the counter, glancing at him with a curious tilt of her head. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, unpacking the haul, apples, a loaf of bread, a block of cheddar, her movements smooth and practiced. "Just thinking about how much I've missed," he said, his voice low, almost to himself. Living next to a successful businesswoman and never suspecting. He met her eyes and she smiled, that quiet, knowing smile that had become so familiar lately. She reached into one of the bags and pulled out a jar of his favorite Italian coffee, the rich, dark roast he'd been rationing, and set it in front of him like a peace offering. "By the way," she said casually, turning to grab a bag of flour, "I've been thinking. Maybe you'd like to join in developing my store." Donald's head snapped up, his hand pausing halfway to the coffee jar. "You want me to work with you?" The question came out sharper than he intended, surprise lacing his tone. "Why not?" Charlotte slid into the chair beside him, folding her hands on the table. "You have a good business sense. Just used it a bit off target before." Her voice was light, but there was a spark in her eyes, a glint of the fire that had drawn him to her all those years ago, back when they were young and reckless and dreaming big. He studied her, leaning forward slightly, caught by the way her gaze held his. Steady, warm, but with a challenge woven in. Those sparks, the ones that had once captivated him, flickered there still, brighter now, tempered by time and wisdom. "An equal partnership?" he asked, testing the waters. She nodded, her expression turning serious. "Equal partnership, like everything else now. No more one of us carrying the load while the other coasts. We'd build it together, your ideas, my framework. But it's work, Donald. Real work." Donald smirked, a flicker of amusement crossing his face as Charlotte's hand settled over his, warm and steady. "You know what life has taught me," she said, her eyes locking onto his with a quiet intensity. "True love isn't about control, but respect. It's not when one manages and the other submits. It's when both are strong and both acknowledge it." He sat back, her words sinking in, stirring the stillness of the kitchen. Once he'd truly believed his role was to be the head of the family, provider, decision-maker, the one Charlotte and Jessie leaned on. It had made sense to him, a neat little picture he'd carried for years, him steering the ship, Charlotte keeping the home fires burning. But that picture had cracked wide open, and now he saw her for what she'd become, what she'd always been, maybe. She'd been living her own life, building something solid and real, while he'd been busy clinging to an illusion of authority. She wasn't his shadow, she was a force, and instead of wrestling for power he didn't even have, he could step up beside her. An ally, not a ruler. Charlotte shifted then, reaching into her bag and pulling out a crisp white envelope. "I've drafted a business plan," she said, sliding it across the table toward him. "Will you take a look?" Donald took it, his fingers brushing the smooth paper, a strange excitement bubbling up in his chest. It wasn't just about the store, it was about this moment, this chance to see her world and join it. He had a lot to learn, he knew that now. Life wasn't about gripping control until your knuckles turned white. It was about finding balance, letting go of the need to dominate and embracing the strength in partnership. He smiled, unfolding the envelope, the faint crinkle of paper loud in the quiet room. "Let's take a look," he said, his voice steady, a promise woven into the words. "Only this time, I'll be more attentive." Charlotte's eyes sparkled, and she leaned back, watching him with a mix of pride and curiosity. The new clock ticked silently on the wall, marking the seconds of this new chapter, while the old one kept its stubborn pace beside it, a reminder of where they'd been and how far they'd come. Outside, the autumn wind swept through the yard, chasing golden leaves in swirling patterns across the grass. It rustled against the windows, a soft whisper of change, inevitable, yes, but this time, unmistakably, for the better. Donald flipped open the business plan, the numbers and ideas blurring for a moment as he glanced at Charlotte, then back at the page. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just looking, he was seeing. And it felt right,